This is always a fantastic session and well attended. And every year it seems like there are more and more people here, which is a good sign in terms of the status of behavior analysis in Pennsylvania. Generally, this is the third most attended session at this conference, the opening, closing being the top two, and this one being the third most attended. And that has just happened over the past couple of years. So thank you, everybody, for coming. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Melissa Nosek, who is a Pennsylvanian from near Cook Forest in the just north and west of here a little bit. And it is an honor to have Melissa here. She is central to the processes that occur at the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. And we are in for a treat to hearing the board updates. So without further ado, Melissa Nosek.
Thank you, Mike. That was a nice, warm welcome. It's always so exciting to be here in Pennsylvania, and thank you guys so much for staying for this late session on certification. I know that this is typically not a topic that people are excited to hear about, but I'm going to try to make it as fun as possible because I sort of love this topic and I like to talk about it, and I promise I'm going to try to end on time too, even though we're getting started just a little bit late. So some background on the BACB. Most of you know that the BACB is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our global mission is to protect consumers of behavior analysis services worldwide. And we do that by systematically establishing, promoting, and disseminating professional standards. We have 3 credentials, for example, and those credentials are accredited by the National Commission of Certifying Agencies. The NCCA is sort of like, I equate it to credentials for you guys, because they set the standards in the credentialing industry. So it's just as the BACB sets standards for master's, bachelor, and technician level practitioners, the NCCA is the standard setting entity for people that offer credentials. So I'm going to bend this a little bit. Can you guys all hear me okay? Okay, good. So the NCCA, for example, about 3 years ago, they changed some standards that all of the credentialed organizations, so x-ray technicians, doulas, all kinds of different professions hold this accreditation. And so their systems and processes have to be reviewed on a 5-year basis for adherence to their standards. So anytime their standards change, we're paying very close attention. Just as if you have students or others that are getting credentialed by the BACB, you have to watch for updates and changes so that you make sure that you're meeting those requirements. So all 3 of our credentials are accredited now, and it is a pretty rigorous process to become accredited. The more recent credential that's been accredited was the RBT, and that was in 2016. Right now, we are going through the process of reaccrediting our BCBA and BCABA certification programs. So this next slide, I sort of love this slide because we are governed by a board of directors. So our board of directors, I really think they're sort of the all-stars in behavior analysis. And they come to an annual meeting every year and they have productive discussions about what's going on in the profession. Our CEO, Dr. Jim Carr, and I'm sort of his right hand. I sort of handle the bottom half of his to-do list. I feel like that's like the best descriptor, but the bottom half of his to-do list is actually really fun, so I don't mind it at all. But so each of our board of directors members represent one of the different credentials and are doing different things in the profession. Some faculty members, some practitioners, and we have a consumer representative. Diana Verity is our consumer representative, and her contributions to the discussion about the profession are so meaningful. And they come from the perspective of somebody that has received and knows a lot of people that receive behavior analytic services. So when there are discussions about standard changes and stuff like that, her input is really invaluable. Now, I just thought I'd give you a snapshot back in time. So one of my bosses is in the audience. Willie De Leon is our current president of the board. But we've had past presidents, beginning with Jim Johnston, Judy Fable, and Jane Howard. Now, as you remember from you might remember from the previous slide, we were established in 1998. So the BCCB has almost been around for 20 years now, which is very cool. So next year will be our 20th year anniversary. And to have so few presidents has provided for a lot of consistency and stability of our board and the direction and the mission and vision of the organization. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about a story of growth. So last year, Dr. DeLeon presented this slide of our org structure and the number of staff that we have at the organization, and there were 29. In 2017, we currently have 43 staff members at the BACB, and 7 of them are behavior analysts that hold leadership positions at the organization. We figured out pretty quickly that we could hire somebody to be our director of operations that has a PhD in OBM, and we can teach her a little bit about accounting and IT systems, and she can set up processes and systems so that our organization is more effective and productive. And our PhD level systems person has been in place for about a year now, and we've seen substantial improvement in the systems and processes in our customer service department and our IT department and in a lot of other areas. So this growth in the organization represents 45% growth in just 1 year in our staffing at the organization. So we're bringing on resources as quickly as possible to stay ahead of the curve of the growth that I'm about to show you that is happening in our profession right now, and it's exciting. So these are our most recent data, and this first slide shows you the overall number of BCBAs per year. So this data point on the end for 2017, what we're looking at, because this is cumulative data, is we're looking at the slope of the line, right? So you'll see that the data point that's there, we haven't even, we're halfway through our testing windows for this year, and that data point is already above halfway to where it should be. So we're looking at another record growth year. Our August examination window, for example, is our largest examination window for the entire year. Lots of people register for that exam window, and it's record-breaking numbers in our Pearson VUE system. So it's very exciting. So we currently have 24,669 certificates at the BCBA level. If any of you have been around long enough that you remember getting a little white card with your certification number and stuff on it, back then we were talking around 7,000 behavior analysts. I won't call it anybody's year, but I will tell you I was certified in 04, and there were about 7,000 behavior analysts in 04. And I thought, gosh, in 10 years, if we have 15,000 behavior analysts, that would be huge. And right now we have 24,669. And this is another really cool piece of data to take a look at. So if you told me back then that every year we would be bringing on between 3,000 and 4,000 new behavior analysts at the master's level, I would tell you you were crazy. But that's what's happening. So every year we have between 3,000 and 4,000 new behavior analysts out there practicing, which means we have to be more diligent than ever about mentorship and supervision and making sure we're doing a really good job at crafting experiences that produce really good practitioners, and that the people out there doing the work are continuing to do a service to the profession with their work. So this is just gets me sort of excited, these data. So the next piece of data is the BCCBA credential information. Now the BCCBA credential, know that this isn't the terminal credential, right? So a lot of people become a BCCBA and then they go on to become a BCBA. And these certificates follow funding streams. So states where there is a funding stream for BCCBA level workers is where you'll see more pop up. And as a matter of fact, I was just looking at the data on where our BCCBAs are located, and they are concentrated in 5 states in the US. And then there are just handfuls of them in other places, but 5 states represent the predominant number of BCCBAs in the profession. And we currently have 2,536. We have as many BCCBAs as we have international certificates in total. So I equate those two a little bit because they're equal numbers, and we have more BCABAs in other countries than we do in the U.S. as far as the percentage of BCABAs to BCBAs. So that's another interesting thing about our international work. So this is the number of new BCABAs per year. You see, like, there's still growth here, and you see the line the variability in these data are quite different than they were for BCBA, but the N is also substantially lower, so you can see these differences much easier. Now, this is the total number of certified behavior analysts between BCBA and BCABA, and I broke this one down so that you guys could see the percentage that are represented by doctoral level BCBAs. We've had some recent legislative initiatives where states have tried to require that a doctoral level BCBA oversee BCBA level people. And when you pull this distribution up and you see the actual percentage of doctoral level behavior analysts, you can tell that's never going to work, right? So we've helped states as they're crafting their licensure law and legislation to make better decisions by showing them these type of data. So 7.5% of total certificates are BCBA-Ds. BCABAs represent more than that, even though that's a small number, and then 83.1% of our certificates are BCBAs. You guys dig this stuff too? Yeah, okay, good. Okay, RBTs. So RBTs are another exciting set of credential. In December of last year, before the TRICARE requirement went into place, we had 10,000 applications in just 1 month. Now, we predicted we were going to get some increases in data right around the time that that requirement went into place. So we added staff to our resources, and we, prior to that, had been getting about 1,500 applications in a month. And then in 1 month, we got 10,000. So you can imagine our customer service department was working double and triple time to try to keep up with that. But for that reason, that year and that month skewed our data a bit. You know, I want like 3 data points where there's some stability and not these external variables that are flooding our application levels. So this year is a little bit more representative. It's been pretty stable over the last 6 months. We've been bringing in between 1,250 and 1,250 and 1,500 new RBTs each month. Now, one of the intricacies of these data that make them a little more difficult too is that this credential also is an annually renewed credential, and there are a lot of people that move in and out of this workforce. Do any of you work with RBTs and supervise them? Yeah, so there are a lot of RBTs that move in and out of this workforce. So in any given month, we might lose 2,000 but acquire 1,800. So sometimes the data seems stable, but it's because of the mobility in and out of this area of work. And people may go on to become a BCABA or a BCBA. So you have that happening too. Okay, so verified course sequences. I'm going to talk a little bit about where verified course sequences are all over the world, how many we have, but I'm not going to spend too much time on this because there are some legislative licensure type things that are relevant to you guys that I want to spend a little bit more time on today. So verified course sequences were really a paperwork reduction endeavor by the BACB because we're such an adolescent profession. Most other professions like occupational therapy, speech and language pathology, they're very much more mature than the profession of behavior analysis. So they've gone through a lot of these growing pains in early years of the profession, and we haven't done that yet. So this verified course sequence function was a paperwork reduction endeavor so that students didn't have to submit all of their course syllabi when they applied for certification. Mature professions have, like the APA has, if you are certified or if you've graduated from an APA accredited program, you qualify to sit for an exam. We didn't have that function. So this was really like, can we tick these boxes off so that we don't have to look at every single syllabi from this university that's graduating 50 students a year? So for our capacity in processing and approving applications, we developed this verified course sequence. And so just, this is the mechanism for getting new certificates. So when there's training program growth and they graduate students, that's when we get more BCBAs, right? So this is really the mechanism. The growth in these training programs really should teach us a little bit about what our future workforce is going to be. So you see here we have 287 course institutions that have course sequences around the world. Now this is just institutions, so this isn't the total number of course sequences. Because some programs have a BCABA course sequence, a BCBA course sequence, and on campus and a distance course sequence. So they might have 4. So this is just the sheer number of institutions that have at least one. And it's 287. Something that's interesting about this image, I don't know where my laser is. Is that a laser? Yeah. Okay, so all these course sequences in Brazil, they're new within the last year. So Brazil has a lot of behavior analysis, but it's always been EAB, and there hasn't been a need for applied course sequences until recently. They're getting a lot more work happening there that is in the applied area, and so they have a number of course sequences now. The data point that's in Japan, that's recent within the last 2 years too. So we have new countries being represented as training grounds for behavior analysts more and more. Okay, so this is the United States map. There aren't many places in the United States that you could live and not have access to a training program in behavior analysis. And you'll notice that the number of course sequences tends to follow the population concentration in those areas. So Wyoming, I think, is one of the places that you would have to move outside of the state to find training unless you did an online program or something like that. But so the growth in the United States has just been huge. And that makes sense because behavior analysis has its foundations in the US. So growing outside of the US and in other countries has been challenging because we still haven't figured out our foundations here in the US as far as licensure and funding and stuff like that. Okay, so now I'm going to have to spend a little bit of time talking about global support. So we are an international organization, and we provide support to our international colleagues and try to reduce barriers as much as possible to their acquiring one of our credentials and doing work in their country. So a few years ago, our board of directors re-articulated our mission and vision to make it really clear that we are international and we do provide global support to practitioners of behavior analysis. Our board of directors also has 2 seats on it that are dedicated to international directors. And currently, Angelica and Javier, they both got their training in one country and then moved to another country where they're practicing. So we actually have representation of 4 countries on our current board of directors, which I think is pretty neat, especially since we have a lot of international initiatives happening right now. Now, the growth in our non-US certificates is growing for sure, but not as quickly as in the United States. And there are a lot of possible reasons for that, but there is growth, and we're trying as much as possible to reduce barriers. We also have an international employee. We have a director of international development, Dr. Neil Martin, if any of you are familiar with him. And he travels a lot for the BACB, helping to set up course sequences in other countries. So we have 2,360 certificates in 80 different countries. And you'll see that Canada, the big black balloon there, they represent over half of our certificates. This makes sense because we share a border with Canada. But also, in the early years of the BACB, it was Canada that reached out to Jerry and Mike Hemingway in the early years and said, hey, can you sort of credential us? We're in Canada, and we really need some way to indicate our legitimacy in our country. And so that's where it started. And so now, yes, over half of all of our international certificates are from Canada. And they are experiencing sort of the same struggles that we're experiencing in the United States related to licensure or regulation at the country level. So these are the number of certificates in the 80 countries that they reside. And I have a funny story about this. So Neil Martin goes to a lot of these different places, and sometimes, like, you'll see some of these countries have 5 or 10 behavior analysts indicated in there. So we always have to make sure for Neil that these data are as up to date as possible, because probably one of those 10 people are sitting in his audience. And so they're like, nope, there's more of us here. So slight differences in numbers are very meaningful and able to be identified when you're giving a presentation in one of these countries that don't have many certificates. So this is the distribution of the verified core sequences in those countries. So Brazil, notice there aren't any core sequences in Australia. I always think this is sort of strange because we have quite a few behavior analysts in Australia. So there are good reasons for that. They have tried to establish core sequences there, but there is some infrastructure that doesn't support it. So for right now, they're just training their people in New Zealand, and then they go live in Australia. Okay. These are the institutions outside of the U.S. So you expect that these 15 in Canada are there, but those 4 in Brazil, those all are within the last 2 years. So that's interesting. These are the places that Neil has been. He actually has a Twitter handle called Where in the World is Neil? And you can go and see where he is traveling. I don't use Twitter, but I've heard people tell me, like, Neil is here or there. There are a lot of times that I think his job is really cool, but when he was in Iceland, I was somewhere really warm and beachy, and I was like, okay, I'll take my role today. But that's a lot of traveling. Like, I think if I were going to a country I'd never been to, I would ask him about visa and immunization requirements and stuff like that, because he knows it all. So one of our other initiatives is the translation of our examination. So we suspected that it was creating barriers for people becoming certified because our exam was in English. So our board of directors a year ago approved a list of languages that would cover 82% of the spoken languages in the world. And these are them. They were chosen based on the demand for certification in those countries and the amount of people that it would represent. Now, we just finished the Polish translation, and it's going to be available in the August window, which is the most recent one. Now, one neat thing about these data are that we keep an eye on this resource and how much it's being used. And so far in the countries where we have translations, so if somebody selects to have the translated examination, they can push a button and still see the English version of the question and answer. So that's helpful, but we still don't have a lot of people utilizing the translated examination. So there will be a point where we step back and we look at these data and then sort of explore the usefulness of this type of a resource and whether it was really a barrier, because if you don't have a lot of people utilizing it, then maybe that wasn't actually the barrier. So we're always working with our international colleagues and surveying them to see what else it is that we can do. One of the things that isn't in the slideshow, but we do now, is because our standards are based on U.S. education standards, anybody that has a degree outside of the United States has to have an equivalency evaluation done for their degree, because in different countries, it's not a psychology degree, it's called something else, but it might qualify as a U.S. psychology degree. And a PhD in another country might not require any coursework, where in the U.S. it does, but everybody that takes our examination for a credential level has to meet the same standards. So those equivalency evaluations can be between $100 and $200 for an international certificate, and they used to have to pay that cost. And so now the BCCB covers the equivalency evaluation through a third-party evaluation system, and then eventually our certificates around the world will pay only what is indicated by their economic zone, for examination. So that will also help to reduce some barriers for our international applicants and certificates. Now, I always like to show this at the end of the international presentation because it's interesting. 95% of the behavior analysts in the world reside in the United States, but 95% of the world population resides outside of the United States. So we still have a lot of work to do in growing our international colleagues and helping to support them. Okay, so some recent developments. So every year, the BACB gives the Michael Hemingway Behavior Analysis Award. Michael Hemingway was one of the co-architects of the BACB when it originated in Florida, and he died early, and when he did, they dedicated this award to him. Now, this award doesn't just go to a really good behavior analyst. This award has gone to a lot of different people functioning in different roles in our profession. But most importantly, this person brings behavior analysis services to more consumers, and that is their mission. So you'll see Lori Unum on here, and Sigrid Glenn, and Jerry Shook, and Representative John Syback. Well, this year, very deservedly, Gina Green received this award, and she really has had her hand in just about every legislative initiative that's happened in this country over the last several years, since 2009 when licensures started happening across the U.S. And she does it very selflessly. Like, the woman breathes and sleeps behavior analysis, I'm sure. So the BACB newsletter in October of 2016, we announced a benefit that we're providing for our certificates, which there are more to come of, but a journal benefit, which I was really excited about because I'm no longer at a university setting, so getting access to journals, it's expensive and hard. I think my first year out of the university, it was all like over $500 just for like 3 journals that ABA publishes. So this benefit we thought was really exciting for us to be able to provide for certificates, and we actually are going to have many, many more coming in the next year. So the ABA journals and several other journals we'll be making available just as soon as we can. But for right now, if you log into your portal, and this is only available to BCBAs and BCABAs, for people that are supervising RBTs and you want them to have access to these articles, I suggest sharing them with them on an individual basis. But because of the sheer number of RBTs and the turnover there, it's not a resource that we can predict the volume or provide at that credential level. So for right now, JABA, JAB, and behavioral interventions are available if you log into your gateway. So pass rates. Several years ago, in 2013 was the first year we did this, but our board of directors voted to make pass rates available. While this is definitely not the most important metric for the quality of a training program, they are data we have, and we decided to make them available to the profession for students and faculty members as one metric to evaluate when looking at the quality of their training program. And so those new pass rates for 2016 are now available. So the development of BACB standards. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this sort of process because, like I was mentioning earlier, most other professions did this a long time ago. So we have standards changes that are happening pretty frequently. Because most other professions are at a steady state, so like if you want to be a speech and language pathologist, you need a degree in speech and language pathology to qualify to be licensed, right? Well, in the early years of behavior analysis, there weren't behavior analysis degrees being offered. So if that's where we started, it would have been a problem because nobody would have been able to qualify. But over the years as training programs have grown and degrees are now behavior analysis degrees, psychology degrees with emphasis in behavior analysis, we've been able to shape the discipline and no longer accept any degree with 5 courses, but narrowing that path to become licensed or credentialed as a behavior analyst and sort of be on par with what all other professions are doing. But the interesting thing is that we're going through this adolescent stage much later than a lot of other professions, so it doesn't seem typical. but they all went through this too. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how new standards are established and developed. So NCCA that I mentioned earlier, one of their requirements is that we use subject matter experts. So the standards of the profession are to be shaped by the people doing the work in the profession, is the philosophy there. So we should bring in experts. Should we bring in experts from the University of Florida or Florida Institute of Technology? When we compose a panel of SMEs, we have to have representatives that were trained in different areas, that live in different geographical regions to represent the profession as a whole. And if it is not appropriately composed, these work groups, there would be a problem with our accrediting agency. So it's a bit of a puzzle to put a work group like this together. So I thought I would show you sort of how eventually how a standards revision will be triggered. So most of the time there's a temporal or professional trigger. So every 5 years we have to evaluate all of our standards. Sometimes there's a professional trigger. So we recently reevaluated our BCBA requirements because many doctoral level behavior analysts that are well known, they publish a lot, they're doing behavior analytic work, which is what the doctoral level designation is to represent. They didn't qualify for our doctoral level credential because the pathway required coursework at the doctoral level. In many other countries at the doctoral level, it's just research that they're doing. So we convened a subject matter expert group. This is one of my favorite groups that we've had since I've been at the BACB. But we had representatives from 8 different countries. So some of our SMEs, it was like 11 p.m. at night, and it was like 6 a.m. for me in Denver. And so arranging, we did it remotely. So everybody like called in for the meeting, but we had people representing multiple different time zones across the world. Sort of cool. But so that was an example of a professional trigger that resulted in us reviewing a standard and the work group suggesting other pathways to determine that somebody had concentrated work in behavior analysis. So usually from there, the CEO presents this information to the board makes a decision to convene a work group or not for the purpose. A subject matter expert work group is composed. A report is given to the board, and this is an important part of this. The board reviews and approves that report, so the recommendations for the work group. So for task list or experience standards or coursework standards, our board of directors cannot choose which pieces that they want to take of the recommendations. They either have to give it a thumbs up in its entirety or a thumbs down. And if it's a thumbs down, it goes back to be reevaluated by another work group independently of the previous work group's recommendations. So it's sort of a neat process, and I've certainly appreciated watching how that happens over the years. So this is just a screenshot of the diversity of an SME work group. It is like a puzzle to put these together. This doesn't include some columns that include training program that people attended. So you have to have so many at each credential level in different locations, so you can't have overrepresentation of one geographical location. Seniority in the field, so people that were recently trained as well as that are mid-career and later career, all represented in these work groups. And then equity in the gender representation of the work groups as well. Sort of neat. As you can imagine, one of the harder participants to get for these work groups are BCCBA level people because there's so fewer of them. And you want to make sure you have BCCBAs they will come and they'll speak up and provide their opinion to the work group. And sometimes more junior level people, it's hard to get them to behave so that we can shape that. So here are some more recent and upcoming work groups. So in 2016, we held a diversity of practice think tank where this was something that our board of directors authorized, and it was not really related to the BACB, but more so as a service to the profession. Because there's work going on in a lot of different practice areas, but there aren't mechanisms for growing those practice areas. So we convened a work group to talk about some of the barriers to growth in other areas of work, like behavioral medicine and gerontology and education. And we developed a list of initiatives. Some of them went to other professional associations, and some of them are initiatives that the BACB is spearheading the organization and development of. I'll just mention a few. This was a very neat work group, but one is a chapter that would be a supplement to a class. And the work group really talked about the point at which somebody made a behavior analyst that is learning about the profession makes the decision to go into a certain area of work, like autism or gerontology, et cetera. And a lot of that has to do with, are there faculty that offer experiences in that practice area? Are those faculty accessible? Is the faculty member that they're working with, they had class with, did they teach them that there are these other options? If you want to be a behavior analyst, you can do all these other things too. So one of the initiatives was a chapter that went through each of the practice areas of behavior analysis that would be introduced as part of an intro to ABA class. So that more students would come into contact with what the options are. If you want to study that practice area, where you go to do it, who you would work with, stuff like that. It's pretty neat. In February of 2017, we had an experience standards work group. If any of you, I'm sure, how many people are certified? Almost everybody, that's great. Well, I'm not allowed to share a whole lot of information when I give these talks if we haven't talked about it yet, but in August, there's an exciting newsletter coming out, and the new experience standards will be published in that newsletter. I still have 15 minutes. Thought I was talking really fast. Okay, so in February of 2017, we had an experience standards work group. And the experience standards work group, depending on the type of work group, like I let you know that the BCBAD was a remote work group. It was only because of the content that we were reviewing for that standard. It didn't require several days of deliberation. So we were able to do that remotely, but this work group for experience standards and the RBT standards work group, those will be on site at the BACB, and those SMEs will conduct their meeting on site, and usually it's a day or a 2-day work group. And then in the spring of 2018, we have BCBA, BCABA degree standard review and continuing education review. Okay. I'm going to talk about the more recent change to standards that's been announced, just to give you an example of the shaping that has happened over time. Super neat to look at. So the BCBA, BCABA task list 5th edition was published last year. And when the coursework work group met, they reviewed the changes to the task list to see if there needed to be changes to coursework to align with the new task list. The primary areas of changes is that philosophical foundations is back on the task list, philosophical underpinnings and concepts and principles. There used to be a foundational knowledge section, if you remember, in the 4th edition task list that was not integrated into the task list. So that work group decided to put that back in the task list, that it was important. Ethics used to not be its own standalone section on the task list, so that was a difference. And then the third difference was the addition of personal supervision and management, which the work group undoubtedly thought this was a really important area for behavior analysts to be trained in. We work with staff all the time. Like, this is a really important skill set for behavior analysts to have. So those were the 3 primary changes. So the work group decided to add some coursework, and so now behavior analysts at the BCBA level are required 315 hours of courses. And the additions and changes were primarily in those areas. So ethics, personal supervision and management, additional 15 hours in that area. But you can see over time how these coursework standards have changed. And we are about at the point where to get all your coursework in behavior analysis, it's not quite what other professions have as a master's degree. How many hours off is it? Probably 15 or 30 hours? For a master's degree in another profession, is it usually 350 hours?
About 2-3 classes.
A couple classes away. So you're getting closer and closer to a substantial amount of coursework. Like, you couldn't just get a degree in something and take additional coursework because it would take you quite a while. And And the same thing happened for the BCCBA credential. I was a practitioner for 15 years, so some of the faculty-specific content, hours of instruction and stuff like that, are sort of new to me, and I've had to learn a lot about it. So we use these hours instead of credits, because in international locations, that's the only sort of universal way to talk about these things. And so when you go to other countries, they use hours to qualify the amount of content in classes too. So that's why that is like the metric for determining the content is hours instead of credits. But so this is a comparison chart from 4th edition to 5th edition coursework. So philosophical underpinnings and concepts and principles. Our work group reviewed these classes, and they had some data that were pretty cool that we pulled from pass rate information. So anytime a course sequence, a verified course sequence, submits all of their syllabi. And so one piece of data that we provided to the work group was the number of training programs that had concentrated concepts and principles classes in the top 10 on our pass rate list and the bottom 10 on the pass rate list. And it was interesting because all 10 of the top 10 pass rate universities had concentrated concepts and principles classes. So those students are getting a dose, like a concentrated dose of our basic concepts and principles, which the work group also thought was important for the training of a behavior analyst. Well, the bottom 10, they all had concepts and principles spread throughout other topics in their sequence of classes. So that was interesting, and it was a piece of information that I think was helpful to the work group to determining like how to make this a little bit more rigorous. And so they required that 45 hours of this content be concentrated in one class. The rest can be distributed in a variety of classes, but 45 hours of those content hours have to be concentrated. They did the same thing with measurement. So instead of measurement being able to be spread out through multiple courses, it has to be in one course. And then they added personnel supervision and management, 30 hours of that. So those were the primary changes, and the BCCBA changes mirrored those as well. So for the BCCBA coursework requirement, it's 225 hours. There were some limitations to the changes at the BCCBA level, and this is why it's so important that our work groups be properly composed. We had representatives that were faculty at course sequences that were standalone master's programs. Because a lot of times at the PhD level, students are assisting with supervision, and there are different structures in place. But the people at the standalone, the standalone BCCBA course sequences, they were aware of what the hours would be limited to in certain areas. And there are some more limitations at the BCCBA level than at the BCCBA level as far as the requirements. So they did some things in certain areas. So 15 hours of ethics needs to be in a freestanding course was one of the changes to BCCBA. So for measurement, they do require 13 hours, or the new requirement is 13 hours, or 30 hours, but it does not have to be concentrated into one course because they thought it would be too difficult at that level to concentrate that class. And then there are additional hours in personnel supervision and management, but also no requirement for concentration. And then I just wanted to mention, so our newsletter, we have a bit of a no fluff policy. So it doesn't ever come out with stories that we thought would be interesting. There are always substantial changes to credential requirements, maintenance requirements, et cetera. So make sure if you don't get the newsletter that you log into your Gateway account and check to make sure that your email address is correct. And like I said, in August, that we will be dedicating a special newsletter to the new experience standards. So pay close attention to that. The last thing I want to talk to you guys about today is U.S. state regulation. And there are some things in here specific to Pennsylvania that I just wanted to talk about. So we currently have 28 states that have regulation for behavior analysts. Those red states up there are states that have put a licensure bill through and it failed within the last couple of years. This yellow star represents the only piece of legislation still in process for this year. So Connecticut's bill is still undecided. It doesn't look promising, but it's still in session. And then all these green stars represent places where behavior analyst organizations are working on, and we've been helping with revisions to a legislative policy. So Pennsylvania is one of those. So the Pennsylvania Association for Behavior Analysis, and there's another group, Applied Behavior Analysis and Pennsylvania Initiative. They have both been talking about proposing new legislation for Pennsylvania. And so in our most recent communications with them, the legislative things that they would put forward would be much in line with the minimum standards for behavior analytic practice as set forth by the BCCBA. So there's APBA, I'm sure, has been involved. Gina Green is the primary person that works on these things, but anywhere our credentials are written into law, we have to review those things. So we are in parts of that process, but last time I spoke to Penn ABA, and they asked me to let everybody know to get involved, ask questions, because they are in the beginning stages of talking about putting legislation forward to help with the current situation in Pennsylvania. Yeah. Yeah. So Penn ABA has a table, thank you, Mike, in the exhibitor area, and they'd be happy to talk to you about it. Jonathan Ivey, he's probably he's going to be here later this week, I believe, and he's the primary person that we've been talking to. So if you run into him, you can ask him about it too. Oh, this is the cumulative progress of licensure. You can see, so in most other professions, just to let you know, occupational therapy took 40 years, and speech and language, 40 years or a little bit more to have licensure across the U.S. Occupational therapy, actually, their last law just passed a couple of years ago. But, so licensure has been happening for us since 2009. This is not a surprise that there are already 28 states with licensure, but I believe that the rest of the states that are to come are going to be much more difficult than these early states that have passed licensure laws. Montana, I was actually in Montana just a year and a half ago. This is an example of like a state that had a very easy time with passing their legislative law. There are 32 behavior analysts in Montana. They were all on the same page about licensure. They knew it wasn't an if, it's a when. And they said, well, before we get too much bigger and we have too many different opinions, we should just write the best bill that we can and get it through. And so within a year and a half, they had their licensure bill through. Now, that is not the case for places like Florida and California. People a lot of times will say, Florida has so many behavior analysts, why wouldn't they have licensure? Well, because they have so many behavior analysts with a variety of opinions is why they don't. Same thing in California. So these legislative processes are so delicate. The moment you have just one person that expresses distaste or just is not particularly in favor of it, and they can influence any legislators, like that kills bills very quickly. And it's interesting, like California is sort of its own government over there, right? They're huge. And the help that we've been providing in California is like providing them with data and stuff, so as they're doing town halls. But it is really expensive to do lobbying work and legislative work in California. It's probably the second most expensive state in the nation as far as lobbying work and stuff like that. So CalABA, they do a lot of work to educate people across the state. But last time they put this effort forth, they got to the late stages after their behavior analysts had put a lot of time and energy into it. And then a group popped up that hadn't been there in the weeks and months prior while they were announcing information. And in the late stages, opposed the bill and wrote letters and California is a very consumer protection state. So the moment they got wind of this is going to impact consumers, the bill died. So I encourage you to pay attention. If you're a behavior analyst in the state of Pennsylvania, pay attention, reach out to your state association. They have been working with APBA and us on language, and ask as many questions as you need to understand so those things don't happen here. It's just really important that there is a united front, because if there are things that happen late in the game, then you might be waiting for another year. And I will also say this, there are a lot of places that licensure may not be something that is necessary, and this is always considered on a state-by-state basis. Each state association sort of evaluates the current laws in their state to see if it's something that's necessary for them. I'll give you an example. In Colorado right now, we have such a neat process. We have this Department of Regulatory Affairs that provide a lot of support to evaluating these things within the state. So in the state of Colorado, there's a year period of time after your sunrise has been submitted where the Department of Regulatory Affairs gives you their experts, and they consult with you for an entire year to evaluate whether licensure is necessary. So it's very possible that in Colorado, they might say, our systems don't require licensure, so certification is not enough, and that's what we'll propose, is that we recognize behavior analyst certification and licensure wouldn't be needed. But that's a really unique process, and it doesn't happen everywhere that way. So there are likely reasons that Pennsylvania has decided that at this time it's something they have to consider or start thinking about. So just pay close attention to that so that you're informed and you know how it's going to impact you. Just some other data. So I mentioned Connecticut is in session and planning for Colorado, Georgia, Indiana, New Hampshire, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wyoming. And then in Canada, there's some regulatory efforts moving forward. So these states to the right, are the ones that didn't progress. And I just want to make a note, those states in red are in the top 10 most populated states in the nation. So they're big states and they're important. And that's all I have to say today. Thank you guys so much for your patience, and have a good evening and enjoy the conference.
Forward to seeing everybody in the morning, and on your way out, please drive safely on your way home if you're driving, and if you're not, enjoy this beautiful evening. The code for the session is V as in Violet, A, T as in Tom, 218. VAT 218. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.